what's up with all the Lenin pictures in your house? And then how is it to look at them every day? In 2001, in a fit of manic collective insanity, I decided to start seeing if I could find Soviet-era artifacts online, mostly through eBay. I had read a paper by James Pennebaker who claimed that past events start to become historically significant about 15 years after the relevant event, and so 2001 was 15 years after the fall, essentially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, or close enough. And so I started looking on eBay to see what sort of Soviet artifacts I might be able to find. First of all, I was kind of curious about what would be available for purchase, and I also thought it was deeply ironic that the most free market of what would you call platforms ever devised, which would be eBay, could now be used to scavenge communist-era artifacts from Russia. You know, it just seemed like, to me, someone who was raised during the Cold War, the fact that I could buy things like heads of Lenin on eBay was just too comical to pass up, you know. And so I started buying things that I had some familiarity with because of what I'd read historically. And the first thing I bought was about a 3x5 silk flag that was awarded to a factory for meeting its 5-year production quota. And I don't know what you know about those infamous quotas, but what would happen is that there were dicta sent down on high about how much factories were supposed to produce, and the implication was produce or else by any means necessary. And so three things happened. The goods were often shoddy because they were rushed. There was deception about how much was actually produced, and then people were radically overworked and undersupplied. So it was a bad system. But it was very interesting to actually have one of these flags and see what they were like. And then I bought a clock, a stainless steel clock, a wind-up clock that was a submarine clock, and it was bomb-proof. So I thought that would be handy if someone ever bombed my house and I needed to know what time it was. So I bought that, and then I found this painting that's actually off to my left here. It's 5 Russian revolutionaries, all young and quite stalwart-looking, standing on the edge of a cliff with a red soldier, or a white soldier, off to the side. They're all shackled together, and he's preparing to execute them. That was a fairly common Soviet motif. And on my right side, I have a decorated Soviet war hero who's working in a steel foundry, and like a lot of the Soviet art glorified, I suppose, the working class, and I suppose there's nothing wrong with that, depending on the degree of propagandistic intent and falsification. But they're kind of like Norman Rockwell paintings, except they don't have the same degree of sentimentality, which is quite interesting. And what's it like to have them around? Well, pretty much every square inch in my house is covered with paintings, and a fair number of them are, I don't suppose, the sorts of paintings that people would usually have in their house. Some of them are of the Second World War, and some of them are strongly political. And, well, sometimes people say, well, I wouldn't want to live in a museum. And I guess that isn't how I feel. I actually like living in a museum, and I like having these historical artifacts around. And I really like watching the propaganda and art war in the paintings, because many of these paintings were produced by very talented Impressionist artists who were trained in the classical European tradition. They spent months making these paintings, and yet they're subordinate in some sense to a political ideology. But what's interesting is that as the political ideology recedes into the past, the more purely artistic elements of the paintings seem to remain. And so it's cool to kind of watch. It's a very slow process, but it's very interesting to watch the art itself emerge triumphant over the propaganda. And then, these things also remind me of what I'm interested in, and that's the study of ideology. And they remind me how powerful ideology can be and how many different pathways it can take to control, I suppose. And it also reminds me of the reality of the 20th century, because it was a terrible reality, and if we forget it, then we're likely to repeat it. Now, my kids grew up in this house, and I asked them about it because I suppose the paintings are fairly heavy and maybe even somewhat frightening, but they really liked it. And it gives me a reason to invite people into my house and gives me something to play with, and I guess I need things to play with by all appearances. So that's the story of the Soviet paintings.